Baylor, I know you've already told me. Maybe I'll make these announcements first. We are broadcasting over the internet. If you're on a conference call, please mute your phone. Thank you. Yeah, I know Mr. Baylor has called in. I'm looking for Dr. Doctavio on the line.
Yes, I'm in.
Thank you. And Dr. Short?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. Are there any other committee members that are calling in? All right, back to you, Doc.
All right, then the first thing to do, Paul sent out with the materials a copy of the minutes from the last meeting. Are there any questions or comments about the minutes? If not, I'll take a motion to adopt them. A second, please. It's been moved to second to adopt the minutes, and there's no objection. We have some presenters for charge number 3 related to competency-based education, so we're going to do that first to allow them to move on to other things. So, Paul, first of all, I'd like for you to discuss with the committee the discussion we had the other day regarding the purpose of the charge. I think there's a little bit of a clarification on that charge that I wasn't aware of and that I think may help us as we go through this. So why don't you do that, Paul?
Going to pass?
He's going to pass it on to me.
Okay,
this is Susan.
Just as well.
When we're talking about competency-based, I don't know that we're necessarily expecting this committee to come forward with a definite recommendation of this is how we're going to do it, because competency-based includes so many different things, and I'm not sure that they're well defined at this point. Currently, the models that we're looking at include where the competencies are tied to an individual course. So when a student completes the competency, all the competencies for that one course, they will report it to us. Down the road, we expect that there will be models that include direct assessment, whatever that turns out to be, and whatever form that turns out to be, the use of MOOCs, there's all those different aspects of competency-based, CLEP, AP, all of those different things all fall into competency-based. How do we incorporate those? How do we fund them, not fund them? There's all those different things that we need to talk about. And we wanted to get that discussion started now for this group to begin that discussion, thinking about it. And if y'all do come up with a consensus of, okay, this is how it should be done, that's fine. But it's not that we actually expect you to come up with a hard and fast, because we know right now you're shooting at a moving target.
Susan mentioned one thing which is not competency-based per se, but can be. We assume it will be if you get credit, which is MOOCs. So they're delivery systems. So competency-based is essentially, when you give credit, you may or may not actually provide instruction for the basis of receiving competency. So Susan mentioned AP. You don't necessarily do anything at the university to do that, but you might give credit for it. So I just wanted to point out that distinction, that a fundamental difference here that we're aware of is that some schools will actually have competency-based instruction, but students still may go through what would appear to be a regular course. And in fact, for financial aid, the federal government has no issue in terms of are you enrolled or not if that competency base is linked directly to a course as we know it. They have difficulties if it's not attached directly to the course. And we're assuming that at some point there will be some institutions that may in fact have ways of determining competencies, but they don't actually provide a course, or they may provide some other types of help. And just from a cost standpoint, that's going to be different. So one of the questions I think ultimately becomes, if it's the typical type of course that you might offer and you end with some common competency across courses, I don't think that's going to be the same type of issue as if, say, A&M decides that they're going to offer some various competency-based exams, but the student may study on their own. They may, do you want to fund that at the same level as, of course, if they were in a normal course? See, even I'm dancing around, but these are some of the issues that we're facing now, and it's better to address them now. And if you guys come up with a way of doing it, as Susan said, that's great. Direct assessment, I think I mentioned last time, is a whole other matter. When I was in Washington, the direct assessment, advocates could not agree on what that is. So I think it's more likely that if you were to come up with something, you could address competency-based, but direct assessment could be going out in the field and watching someone do something. It's a whole range of other things, but you need to be on top of this because it is one of those potential things that are changing and instruction. We want to make sure there's at some point something provided in the formula that will allow institutions to go in this direction if they think it's feasible and fits within their institution structure, that they should do it.
So anyway, it's obviously for this committee, it's entirely focused on some formula funding aspect of competency-based education. How do we essentially fund this to the extent institutions pursue this in the future?
I think most people don't really refer to AP as competency-based, but I've brought that up internally, saying we have students who will get, say, 30 hours of AP, and they still take 130 hours of college courses or 120 hours. Do we want to find some way to encourage them to actually use those courses to graduate soon? I have a niece and nephew who did just that. Actually almost 2 years, yet they took 4 years to graduate, and they got 2 degrees between them with double majors in each. And it's good, but there was no encouragement for them to move forward if that was the best thing to do.
Okay. Unless there's any questions right off the bat, we can go ahead and go to Dr. Eklund to get more of the background on it, and then obviously you have some questions at that point in time. So Julie, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. I am learning, as you are, about competency-based education. It's an important thing for me to understand because I work in the Planning and Accountability Division, and we're starting to think about reporting for competency-based education and how that's going to work, what kind of information we're going to collect, and what reports we now use that we'll be able to adapt to collect information about competency-based or that will need to be changed. As Paul might have mentioned, our agency expert in this area isn't here today, but I've spent quite a good bit of time with him trying to better understand this, and we've put together, with Paul's help, a short presentation for all of you just to cover some of the basics that I think are important to understand. We're also very fortunate to have with us 2 folks from out in the field that are involved in our competency-based education pilot, which is at South Texas College and at Commerce. And we have with us Dr. Dolores Wright, who is at A&M Commerce, and Ms. Roseanne Moore, who's at South Texas College, and I'm happy to have them here. So if there are questions that I'm unable to answer, I'm sure they'll be able to do that. Or if I provide some kind of misinformation, I hope they will jump in and correct me. Let's go to the second slide. And I think it's hard to see the screen, so probably most of you will be working off a handout, and it's useful. We put the presentation notes in here for you to provide more information. This slide is specifically about the pilot program. We really wanted to talk about the pilot because, as Dr. Gardner and Ms. Brown talked about, there are so many different models that are out there that we're trying to understand, and new ways of thinking about this coming in all the time. So we want to explain what's happening now in Texas in terms of this pilot, and then we can talk a little more broadly. So what this slide shows is something that is, I think, very important for us in terms of thinking about competency-based, and that's the fact that the credentials for the competency-based education are being mapped to courses in Texas, and course equivalencies. So although the slide is small, so we couldn't fit a lot of modules in, it's my understanding that for most of these courses there are going to be more than 3 or 4 or 5 modules. There are going to be several modules. But we wanted to visually show you that there are several modules that will be mapped to each specific course, and the courses will include gen ed courses. They'll include, I believe, 90 hours of lower level. So they'll have several courses will be mapped to the modules. And a student does not have to follow through in terms of these competency-based modules, one to the next to the next. A student can go in and show mastery and establish mastery in the order that they would like to go through. It's also the way this program is set up. A student can work on one set of modules linked to a specific course at one time, or they can be working on several different modules that are tied into different courses in terms of the equivalencies. So although they are tied to courses, mapped to courses, don't think of it in terms of moving through in a very sequential way necessarily like we would have with courses. There are some things that are going to be sequential about the program. The fact that there are certain key courses, rhetoric and I think contemporary math to be specific, that students will need to start with that are prerequisites for other modular work that they will do. But beyond that, there also will be some students who are moving around, and I hope I've characterized that correctly. Dr. Rice, was that characterized appropriately?
Yes, you have.
Good. Students will, this is not going to be structured in regular semesters. They're going to be enrolled in 7-week terms, and they'll be enrolled for 6 7-week terms throughout the year if they want to enroll in all of the available terms. However, there will be some students who will choose to enroll for a term or two and then leave, stop out, and then come back in. There's no requirement, it's my understanding, there's no requirement that students be enrolled in all of the 7-week terms. So again, this is the type of program that has flexibility built in, especially for students who are working. There is a flat fee of there will be for this pilot, again, this is just for the pilot, there'll be a flat fee of $750 per term charged to the students, and that's whether they take one set of modules, they work on one set of modules linked to one course, and I don't want to say take one course. I would be very careful not to do that because these really are, although they're linked to courses, they're competencies. So whether they work on one group of competencies that is tied to one specific course, or whether they're working on several groups that are tied to 3 or 4 different courses, the fee is going to be the same, and students do not need to complete within that 7 weeks. They can move into the next period and still have competencies that haven't been, where they have not established mastery.
I would just,
yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Eklund, can I just make one correction?
Yes,
this is
please do.
Moore.
Please do.
While your statement's correct, one of the things I would like to clarify is that we are looking for the students to complete a competency within the 7 weeks.
Oh, okay.
But if they haven't completed all of the competencies for that course, then they can move those competencies forward.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And here's a key piece, and it's in the notes, and I think it's very important to understand that it's only instances where all of the modules linked to a specific course are successfully completed. So it's only in those instances where it's going to be reported to the coordinating board, and the mastery that's being required for the pilot is 80% on each module. So it's not 50% on one module and 100% on another and 90% on another. It's in my understanding, it's 80% mastery must be shown on each module for the student, for that to be considered complete, and all of the modules will have to have been successfully mastered at an 80% competency level before that the course that is linked to those modules is reported to the coordinating board, and that'll be on the CBM 004. So that sort of finalizes our little map here that once a course is completed, it'll be mapped back, and we will, and for those of you who are familiar with reporting, in some ways similar to a flex course, we will have it reported when the course itself that is linked to the module is completed, when all of those modules are completed. Admission to the program is selective. This is not something that any student can come in and say, I heard you're doing a pilot on competency-based and I'm interested in doing that. I think it is probably not a typical student population that's being expected. It's probably going to be older students and students who come in with some competencies. So let's go to the next slide. And there'll be plenty of time for questions after this. If you have any questions, we can go back to earlier slides. And this is really where we're talking about a lot of what is specifically going to be going on in the pilot, but also beyond that, we're trying to present you with a little bit of background in terms of how assessment works here. And I think you need to think of assessment a little more broadly when we think about competency-based. So think about things like review of portfolios in some cases. Don't think of it necessarily as a traditional paper type test or computer type test. And direct assessment is a term that I've been trying to get my head around because it's a term that's used frequently in terms of competency-based education. And it's my understanding that all of the things we're going to talk about in these slides can be thought about as direct assessment. There's just some differences in terms of what it means. So one thing that we can talk about in terms of assessment, it's assessment of prior knowledge. And all these things we're talking about right now are module-based, so we'll look at some course-based issues too. But in terms of assessment of prior knowledge, this is a situation where the student coming in to the program will not utilize learning resources that are available. There won't be any specific instruction for the student. The student will come and demonstrate that the student had prior competence. It was already understood the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to complete that particular module or group of modules. So that's one situation. And all of these, of course, will be used with the pilot. Then you have a situation where the student will be directly assessed on independent learning that the student has done. So the student will be reviewing content and interacting with content that has been developed for the module as part of this. But the learning will be self-directed. In this case, it'll be content that the student is, we assume, able to master without additional assistance because they're going to be moving through and then assessed. If there are some issues in terms of the student needing assistance, it would move into the next area. But there are going to be situations where students are able to move through this material without additional assistance, but they will be interacting with the material rather than just coming in and going into an assessment situation. And then, of course, the student will be assessed to see if these competencies have been achieved. And then the final portion, which is obviously a very important part and involves more resources. In fact, each step, as you can see, involves additional resources than the prior one, but they all involve resources. So the final one is a structured content review where there is instruction happening with the student. There is specific coaching or tutoring. The term coach is used, and they're going to be in terms of the pilot program, they're going to be employing coaches to work very directly with students, but there will also be instruction that you may think of as being more typical and working with groups in an online situation and other types of situations. And then again, the competency will be demonstrated through assessment once the students have moved through this material. In addition to these models where the students are working through different modules, so you could have a situation where the student is enrolled in what we would call a typical course, but again, I don't want to say enrolled in the course where the student is trying to achieve competencies on all the modules needed for a course, and they're doing a mixture of these three different things. There are some competencies that they may already have coming in and be able to demonstrate that. There are some where they'll be able to work through the material and be able to demonstrate that, and there's some where they'll either need more help or some that are designed. For example, I know there's some, Dr. Davis was talking about some team building things. There are some that are designed to have students interacting with each other, and that's very much part of showing the competency is to show something like teamwork. So those are examples that are kind of a direct assessment link. But then on the last page, we wanted to include, and this is I think why my colleagues were talking about this earlier. We wanted to talk about the fact that transfer credit and other types of testing do play a role in competency-based education, and it's important to include that in a conversation. There will be students who come in who will either have prior coursework or they will have done prior testing, whether it's something like AP or CLEP testing. American Council on Education has testing. There's prior learning assessments. There's a lot of work that students may have done or where they may choose to show their competencies through this. For the pilot program, it's set up for those students to get to actually apply to get the credit through Excelsior, but that isn't something that necessarily will always be the case, but that's how it's set up for the pilot if they're getting credit, for example, for something like CLEP or other things that they've done. There will also be potentially course-based learning that's going on, and whether it's prior coursework transferring in or a student who decides, you know what, there is one particular course where I think I'm better off taking the course rather than showing my competency through this series of modules that are linked to the course. So it's my understanding that for the pilot, or certainly thinking about competency-based in the future, that there might be situations where you've got students doing some hybrid type things where they're taking a course or two. But primarily the program is based on them demonstrating competencies through direct assessment.
Could I add one clarification about the AP and CLEP? And this isn't specifically about South Texas or A&M Commerce, but every institution knows how to deal with AP and CLEP. You have ways, you've been doing that forever. So I just wanted to clarify the one thing I've wondered, and I've talked to some institutions about in the past, which is in the case of, say, the student who has 45 hours of AP credit, they graduate including that with 120 hours. Should we consider at some point at least giving some modest funding to the institution for those 45 hours? Right now you receive nothing for it. It might be very minimal, but as a way to encourage the advising to get them through in that way, rather than there just be an extra so many hours. So it's not as though people don't understand AP. Everybody understands AP and CLEP, and each school has slightly different policies about how they deal with that. And it may be of no value to do that. But I just wanted to clarify, it's not because schools don't know what to do about that, but it's should there be any consideration in the model to help students get through school more quickly, because you might have some additional advisement because of it, but at least maybe for those 45 hours, there might be $20 for each hour rather than the 100 and whatever you might get through the formula funding. So again, that may be just not even in left field somewhere out in another county, but that was what that was intended to talk about.
Okay, and I apologize, and I think the conversations we had were how that fit in context with the specific competency-based pilots, that there was an understanding there would be students coming in perhaps with CLEP or that sort of thing, and there's the arrangement through Excelsior in this case for those, but it wouldn't always be the case.
I understand that. I'm just saying broader context.
Yeah.
That's
yes, absolutely.
Beyond South Texas and A&M Commerce, why would we consider that at all? Because everybody knows how to deal with that in the current form. I'm just saying, should we consider as a state at least providing some financial encouragement to do that if students actually graduate, use those for a timely degree plan?
Are you done, Julie?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Does Dr. Rice or Ms. Moore have anything to add?
This is Dolores. I just wanted to make one clarification with the coach and tutor. So there are two different roles. The coach will be there as a support system, mentor, and to make sure that the student progresses, and also use the learning analytics to make sure that the student is kind of on track. And if there are any red flags, that they will address that with the student and kind of keep them moving through the program. And then the tutor will be the content expert or instructor of record. For us, it'll be a teaching assistant, and we'll provide the content within the course and make sure that they are engaging with the students in the course.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions for Julie or the others? Sure, Cynthia.
When will these programs be launched?
Right now, the expectation is January, but that's actually a delay from where they were initially going to be launched because of some issues related to SACS. I think they're working through some of the approvals right now. So right now, the expectation is January, but that's not set in stone.
And are there estimates of the enrollment?
Yes. Overall, there's the capacity for 250 students, but they do not expect, nor do I believe they want that many students to start with. So they're expecting to start with quite a smaller group, though I was never given an exact amount, and maybe the
20 maybe?
Well, no, 20 is less, I believe, than I've heard. And maybe Roz or Ms. Moore, maybe you could enlighten us here a little more if you have some sense of how many students you're going to have in that first group in January.
So for us, we're looking for 40 students in the first group at South Texas College,
Okay.
with 80 over the course of that, by the end of that first term, academic year.
Okay. And in terms of Commerce?
We don't have a specific number that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're just prepared to roll out, and if we get 250 between the two institutions, of course, we don't expect that, but we're prepared to go full blast with the students.
Okay, thank you.
Julie, this tie of the modules to a course, is that structured strictly for this pilot, I assume?
It is for the pilot. Actually, this is not really affecting this group, but the TSTC Harlingen, and actually also at their Hutto campus, where they're working with Temple, I believe, they're doing some competency-based, and it is all tying it back to courses. My understanding, and I wish Van was here, my understanding is that right now SACS is requiring that they tie back to courses. And that's...
It's related to financial aid as well, because the feds are tying this into Pell. So in a way, Pell is as much an issue as SACS is at this point.
Now that sounds different than what WGU is doing, because it sounds like WGU is trying to actually get away from a course type system. So, but they've been accredited. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure why. For our purposes, tying it back to a course makes it a lot simpler if there's a funding issue involved. It gets a lot more difficult if we're talking about some kind of WGU arrangement.
You've hit it right on the nose, John. At least from my standpoint, I think the real issue for competency-based is when are you assessing prior learning? And in their case, I've forgotten how many hours you can get credit for potentially through their system, and as many hours as you want in a 6-month period. And when that's done, if that's seen as a model and the university wants to use in the state, what kind of funding should go along with that kind of competency-based instruction? So if you award, however you did it, it could be in clusters, it could be the equivalent of individual courses, but when you actually haven't delivered necessarily instruction. Now, WGU, as I understand it, will in some cases provide some access to instructors somewhere in the process, but you're not really taking a class. But I think you've made the right distinction from a funding standpoint.
So let's think of the easiest approach from this from a funding perspective would be to tie it to a course, which is what our current system is based on, essentially. But our current formula is based on a cost-based matrix. So if we tie it to a course and this course is submitted as any other course, then we would be rewarding institutions beyond what I assume their costs are. So we would have to have some kind of reporting that would involve actual cost of delivering these particular type of courses, modules or however they're defined, and treat them separately or as some kind of fraction of a typical matrix cost, or is that what we're thinking here?
From my limited knowledge, that's sort of where I end up. And as you guys think about it more, you may find another another way to approach it that's, makes more sense. But to me, there's never enough money to go around, and so but you'd like to encourage new practice where it's feasible, but you don't want to encourage people simply giving exams and nothing more if it's because they can earn more money that way, or the same amount of money with much fewer costs. But if that's the best way to deliver, we'd like to encourage that, but stay on the cost-based matrix.
And one thing that we did talk about a little bit is there is one, and I mentioned it, so I want to mention again, there is a difference in terms of the reporting in that only the students who have successfully completed at the 80% right now, at least in the pilot model, are going to be reported. It is not all students who will be enrolled. It's if they successfully complete all of the modules at 80% for the course.
Yeah, Martha.
Is this course then sit in a program in the pilots? I mean, is the course an equivalent for something in an existing degree program?
Yes.
This is Roz Moore. I can answer that question. The way we plan to set it up is to actually have the courses that are currently existing in inventory at both South Texas College and Commerce. So a student will actually register for the course, but when they actually go into the course within our learning management system, Blackboard or eCollege, they will actually see the competencies broken down within the course. So that's the distinction. But they will have to complete all of the competencies within that course in order to receive credit for the course. And once they receive credit, the idea was that would be when South Texas and Texas A&M Commerce would actually report it for funding.
To go to your question, John, because if it's inside of a rubric, isn't it just going to be counted for funding on the way that cost is? Because, Paul, if we ran this through, the costs are at this stage are going to be so kind of minimal, it'll be absorbed by the overall cost of that particular discipline at that level. And
yeah, I think the reporting is going to be different, though. You may be able to set it up in such a way that everything ties similar to this pilot program where you've got modules that tie very neatly to a course, and then you can determine some kind of, there'll still have to be some kind of separate reporting on the actual cost of that type of course, in effect, I guess, and then how that gets treated in the formula. And obviously, if it were run apart from the formula, it'd be easy to do probably, because you just have a separate formula just for these type courses. But there may be a way to do it, again, based on what you report within the current formula. And I guess that's what we have to kind of look at. I don't know that we can decide that among this group, but we can make some recommendations on that. Martha, sure.
Thank you for your presentation. I just want to make sure I'm thinking about this the right way. You said that they wouldn't necessarily have to take each of these modules when you first started talking about the modules, correct?
Well, I said they didn't have to take everything in a sequential order. You'd have to complete you would have to show mastery in all of the modules in order to complete the course that's affiliated with those modules, that has been mapped to those modules.
So if I completed module 1-3, mm-hmm. That's not the hardest module of the 3. In other words, I also have to do 1 and 2.
That's correct. You'd have to all of the ones.
Right.
Exactly. That's my understanding. Exactly. You have to complete every module, just not necessarily in the order in that order.
Okay. Thanks.
So I wouldn't envision a system where we're going to reward based on completion of a module. There would have to be completion of the course itself, just like any student now. One thing on the part of this is an assessment of prior knowledge. So just as an example of the kind of things that would be reported, I assume the only cost associated with that is just the cost of the assessment and the administration of that assessment.
And the development, yeah. I think, which is another important piece.
Okay. BJ?
Is there a limit on, okay, so you take your first 7-week term and you don't master all the competencies. Is there a limit on how long that can go on?
Maybe somebody from one of the institutions can.
One of our concerns that we've talked about is exactly that. And one of the discussions that we've had with financial aid and with our admissions is whether or not it would be possible to track students in this particular program separately so that there would be funding while students are actually working on the competencies. And by that I mean the way it's structured now, the funding would only occur after the student completes the course, what we're calling a course, the competencies that are tied to the course. We've talked about for a particular competency, a student only has until that next 7-week term to complete the actual competencies that they've started within a course. And that way we're able to keep the same measures that we have, similar to a student taking an incomplete and having the next full term to complete that incomplete. That way our funding for financial aid and all of our other systems are the same. I don't know if that answers your question. So we also have the academic coaches that are there to advise the students in order for them not to prolong the process. But what we're looking for is if a student actually registers for the course, that they're completing all of the competencies for that course either within that particular 7-week term or by the end of the next 7-week term.
And at the end of the first 7-week term, they get an I or an incomplete. And then if they don't complete it by the next one, that grade will automatically convert to an F.
So my reason for asking that is back to your question about reporting for the cost matrix. And if it crosses an academic year, then we have competencies that we can't fund but have costs for that should go somewhere in the cost matrix, or either we hold those costs for however long.
No, the costs would all get reported to match the AFR. What would happen is the hours wouldn't show up with them, so it would be a higher cost per semester credit hour for that particular period. That's the way I think we would do it. Does that make sense?
I have to think about it for a minute.
Yeah, I think this competency-based learning is really a subset of a broader issue that's being discussed, and that's just the semester credit hour system itself, or the semester system. And I don't see that change anytime soon, but there will be institutions that will experiment with that, and to the extent, then those kind of issues could become an issue with any course offering. So I guess we have to sort of look at it in that context too, because that's a part of what's going on here. This is somewhat of a narrow way of getting to a very different way of offering courses, modules, whatever you want to call them, over periods of time which don't fall within a semester or a school year or academic year or whatever. So. Any other questions? Yeah, say it.
I was trying to relate it to, and I don't know if the people on the phone have seen that graph that sort of makes the distinction when between skills and learning abilities, competencies, and demonstrations. And so I'm trying to kind of, are there any considerations of those kinds of definitions that the modules contain the skills, abilities, and knowledge, and really the course really is where they're integrated into the competency? Is that the model that, in terms of the way this particular paradigm was trying to describe a possible definition for competency-based courses?
I'm not sure I fully understood, but perhaps the folks listening Any feedback on that?
There's a graft in the materials that you sent us.
Okay.
That on page 4.
Okay.
Which sort of says, in trying to reach a definition of what competency-based is, that we've got to start with making distinctions. That part of the problem has been a vocabulary problem, and when it comes to competency-based definitions, and that. Everything gets so skills and abilities are meshed with competencies and demonstrations, and students that demonstrate are thought to be competent and skilled. And so for the purposes of designing the way that these modules would be created, this particular paper suggests that there needs to be these definite sort of levels that you go through, and it helps with assessing where the students are. I mean, it includes their own native characteristics and traits, and then goes up, what have they learned, and have they learned then to integrate that into skills that get the job done, and, then finally, do they have competencies that mean that they can manage? I mean, so it goes up like a hierarchy of assessment of what this prior learning is about. So I'm wondering if the design of the pilot from modules up to courses was designed to kind of follow that particular model.
Now, I'm actually looking at page 25. I think most of you have probably found it now. It makes some more sense. And I don't know if the folks on the phone have this. I don't think that's exactly the case, but again, this is just my understanding of it. I think of it more that the building it into the courses is just it's a way to think about it in a way we're used to thinking about education, in a way where we can think about reporting and all of that. But I think on the chart where it talks about all the activity going on with integrative learning experiences between the skills, ability, and knowledge and the competencies, that's about the students coming in with some of those skills, abilities, and knowledge. Some of it's based on traits and characteristics and things they've built up over time. And then you've got the skills, ability, and knowledge. And then the students, the work there is about making sure that what is needed to show the competencies, all of the different competencies, then to be able to complete them for the course, that a lot of that is the active work that goes on, whether it's through assessment or through coaching and instruction and tutoring. And the demonstrations is the assessment in the end. So that's my understanding of this. But again, this is new. So certainly in the end, if the demonstrations are there for all of the modules, I guess you could think of that when you've done all those things for a particular, what we've decided to link to a particular course because of the learning that we expect to go on in a course, that would make some sense. Yeah.
And that's correct. We built the curriculum for the course both at the core and the elective, and we're also doing it for the upper division from more of a bottoms up. So we looked at what are those skills, knowledge, and abilities that students need to have in the course, as opposed to starting with the course and looking at learning outcomes for the course. We started with what do they need to know and what do they need to be able to do in that particular course. And then we built up from there, utilizing Bloom's taxonomy, utilizing the 6 levels of, cognitive learning, from knowledge up through execution and application. And we built it from that direction. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for.
I happen to sit in on a couple of their meetings, and I think she described very well. I mean, this is really sort of almost a curriculum development approach that you have to have in the competency-based instruction for it to be meaningful and for people to accept it, particularly across the department, that they all agree that these are the competencies. And you actually did this through the core as well, didn't you?
We did this for all of the core curriculum as well. We utilized the Texas State core curriculum that's due to come out in 2014 as our foundation, but we identified, utilizing that, what we thought the skills, knowledge, and abilities were for each of those.
Aren't there private vendors out there that will develop these courses as well, or these modules? Pearson or somebody like that, and I assume
you might want to talk about Pearson's role and what you've done here.
Dolores, you want me to?
I can't hear the question. Can we talk
Okay.
about it? And what was the second part of that? And I can address it.
What was Pearson's role
Okay.
in developing the curriculum?
Okay, sorry. Pearson is our vendor that we're working with primarily at the lower division and electives. So they have their courses that are already developed in their system. And what we did was we had our faculty come together from both institutions for each discipline. So for history, for English, for math. And again, as Ross described, develop what were the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we wanted the students to have, and then work backward and say these are the learning outcomes, and then these are sub-outcomes, and then these are maybe assessments and evaluations. And then we provided that to Pearson and matched it with current curriculum that they have and worked with their designers to match what we have on our end with what they have in stock. And now we're actually in this iterative process where our faculty are still kind of reviewing documents. So we took our vision for the course or the competency, gave it to Pearson, and now their people, along with our faculty, we're going back and forth and saying, okay, these are the 14 learning outcomes for this particular course. This is the title, this is the presentation, this is the multimedia discussion exam. So it gets pretty detailed, and we go back and forth kind of looking at the design documents all the way so they build it within our system. And we have two different systems. A&M, we have a college, and then South Texas College has Blackboard. And so we build it from the ground up at this point. And Pearson works with us to get all of the content from the actual questions to the stock photos to multimedia content, and we review everything.
And one thing that we put on the table was that these...
Is it possible to... I think I can barely hear.
Well, one thing that we had put on the table, and I know I talked with Van Davis quite a bit about, is that whatever was developed here, we want to be made available to other public institutions in the state if they want to choose it, particularly in terms of the core. No requirement, but or if you at least wanted to use as the base for your own development. So, I mean, it's quite a lot of work. And I think that these institutions have put together a good foundation, but they may, if you were to want to do the same thing and look at them, they might not entirely fit what your institution would want to do, but you shouldn't have to start from scratch.
Are there any other questions or comments?
I have a couple
Cynthia,
of comments.
go ahead.
I think just in thinking about how we handle this for the formulas for the next biennium, given the volume here, I think the impact's going to be pretty minimal. So we have some options to think about. I mean, we could fund them just as we do all other hours for this particular biennium because the impact will be pretty minimal. Or we can include them separately as part of the cost study to kind of delineate the cost structure for those hours. That also seems like it would be pretty easy to do given the volume that will occur with these programs, because over time I think there will be a different cost structure based upon what you mentioned earlier, John. The costs related to traditional courses versus these will be pretty significantly different. So down the road we do need to identify those differences and fund them possibly at a fraction or at a different level.
Well, I assume that because this is groundbreaking in terms of the formula, that there's a lot of reporting issues that have to be resolved before we could ever get to a funding mechanism. And I'm not sure we can do that within this next biennium anyway. So I think our report would be to try to clarify those things that we think, if something that needs to be reported not currently being reported or reported in a different way, those are the kinds of things we need to recommend that the coordinating board start looking at, so that when we come back around next time, we'll have the data we would need then for a more formal recommendation.
And then not fund them for the next biennium?
Yes, however they're being funded now, it would
continue.
Yeah, it'd continue the way it is. And like you say, it's fairly marginal, I assume, but an area that we'd expect to grow. What I would suggest is that everybody I know needs to think about this and talk to people on your campuses about it. If you have particular ideas of things that we ought to include in the recommendations, or even just as way of background to help provide a context for them, please send those to Paul. And then whatever we have, we'll pull together and have those available for the next meeting. Is there a reason to have Van here next meeting for any further discussion, or just as a resource, I guess, if nothing else?
I think that it would be valuable to have him here just to continue the conversation, and he'll have some higher level answers for us, some more experience with what went on our end at least in putting the pilot together.
Okay. Then if we can just pull our ideas together, again, send those to Paul. We'll have those available to have some more discussion at the next meeting with Dr. Davis here. And then from that, we'll begin to develop some recommendations that we'll circulate to each of the members of the committee after this next meeting, if that's all right with everybody here. Okay. Okay. Then let's move on to charge number 2. This shouldn't take very long, but Paul, why don't you tell us what you sent us, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So what I did was I made a run with the current base year data that we have, running it as it was funded at the $62.19 for the I&O and the $6.09 for the infrastructure. What that generated was about $500 million more would have had to have been funded in order to reach that level. That doesn't include any growth or any inflation that we might take into account with a formula funding recommendation.
Okay, so this $552 million increase does not take into account enrollment and inflation?
Correct.
Well, you could say it covers inflation because obviously the rate's increasing enough to cover that, but there's no specific adjustment for enrollment in this.
No.
Well, last time Paul provided us with the amounts of the recommendation if we just did enrollment growth and inflation, an inflation adjustment, which is essentially what we've done in recent biennium anyway. So this kind of provides the parameters, I guess, of what we could do, and that gives us a range. My recollection is the enrollment and inflation was around a little over $300 million. Is that right?
Yeah, growth was about $100 million. Inflation was about $200 million.
Okay. And is there anything that will occur between now and, let's say, December 1st that would call for any adjustment in those numbers?
No new data will be available between now and the end of this committee.
Okay. This is a charge I guess we can make a decision on. Technically we can do it today, but there's no reason that we have to do it today. So at the next meeting, though, after you've kind of thought about this, we can come back and make a final recommendation on it. I'll tell you what I was thinking after I looked at the numbers that Paul sent me is that that our recommendation would be pretty much consistent with the last couple of biennia of enrollment growth plus inflation, but that we also include something in the narrative of that part of the report that refers back to the 2011 level of funding and what the cost would be if the legislature were to try to get back to that funding level. And there was some discussion during the legislative session about doing just that on some kind of incremental basis. So that would at least tell them where they need to get to. Any comments on that? So we'll discuss that at the next meeting and hopefully make a recommendation. Okay, then we can move to charge number 3, and charge number 1. I'd really anticipated that most of our discussion on outcomes-based funding would be at the next meeting. I still anticipate that would be the case. But just as a way, a segue into that, first of all, Paul, I think you sent us some material that the committee asked for last time. as a part of this charge, and so what was included in that?
So the question with this charge was, what was the story with the 7 states that decided to discontinue their models? Some of the information on the website that I pulled that data off of was not as up-to-date or correct as we'd hoped it would be. 3 of these reported they did have a model, but 3 of them reported that they didn't know about a model, but they were going to add models. So they're looking at some outcomes-based or performance-based funding. And without actually reading what I wrote, I'll stop there.
So my sense overall was that if you look at states, a lot of states are obviously looking at this. A few states have, in effect, stuck their toe in the water because some of them have been pretty minimal steps. And then there's a couple of states that have been more aggressive, Tennessee most notably. So I think in terms of, the commissioner's discussion at the first meeting, because the legislature failed to adopt the board's recommendation in the last session, part of the charge to the committee was to look at that and determine if there were ways that could be improved, changed, or whatever that might lead to better buy-in from the legislature. And I guess the initial thought I'd have on that is that there was discussion last time in the advisory committee about whether any outcomes-based funding should be either inside the formula or outside the formula. And to me, that's kind of a confusing way to describe it. I think is it going to be a part of the existing formula, or is it going to be simply a separate formula completely? And my recollection is that the committee recommended that it be outside, right? And just based on discussions during the legislative session, I think it pretty much has to be outside to get comfort level of the members of the legislature. So that will be an issue that I think we will need to reinforce much more strongly, perhaps than we did last time, to make clear that this is going to be the best way to do it. That creates a different funding decision for them, but I think that's the ones dealing with appropriations are well aware of that. The other question then is, are there things with the current model that we feel like we need to change, tweak, or whatever, or do we need to look at something completely different? And I know we spent a lot of time on this last time and looked at different things, but in effect, last time we did start with a model that was based on what the coordinating board had recommended in the prior session. We sort of built from that. But Paula, are you still on the phone?
Yes, I'm on the phone.
Okay. I know you and I had a discussion about this a couple of weeks ago, and you've had some time to think about it. And for those of you who don't know, Paula was involved in the work in Tennessee when they went to outcomes-based funding, so she's very knowledgeable of the issue and obviously comes with a different perspective. So Paula, what are your thoughts now that you've had some time to think about it?
I think that actually some of these issues were raised in meetings this past spring with some of the coordinating board staff. I think it centered around trying to look at a model that would be a model that wouldn't redistribute, but a model that would really, truly reward performance. And that was one of the main concerns. I think the other had to do with mission distinction, to what extent the proposed model actually acknowledged the fact that there are distinct missions across institutions in the state, and whether or not there is a weighting system that could be used that would acknowledge that. I think these were the key things that we talked to the staff there about, and I would like for the group to continue our conversation around that. these were foundational to the model that we, funding formula, the performance funding model that was finally adopted in Tennessee and appears to be working really well. And I think the other thing is developing a model that doesn't reward size but does reward performance. I think it gets back to the issue of how can we make sure that we don't take an institution that is working really hard and performs really well, but because another institution was already so far down the road that even an institution that performs well still will be disadvantaged in terms of the ultimate funding that's rewarded. And I think we did some calculations that show how the proposed model will do that. And so it continues, again, to be an issue of truly rewarding performance. So those, John, are the things that, we continue to want to discuss further and explore with the group or a subgroup how those might be addressed. I want to say, though, I am a proponent of outcomes-based funding. I am not against the concept with the completion agenda that we all are struggling with and want to see advanced in the state. Certainly was the agenda in Tennessee. It is a game changer, I can tell you that. But it's got to do what you want it to do, and I think to some extent rewarding performance is the goal, and so just need to make sure that the model, whatever model is chosen and adopted, that it truly does that. So those would be just thoughts that I'd share with the group, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that.
Sure. I assume that the discussion we just had prior to this of running this as a separate formula addresses your first point, that it gets away from the redistribution issue,
right,
more or less.
Right. But
okay.
You asked for our concerns, and that was
right.
That's what were my concerns.
Okay. Are any other comments on what we might want to focus on or do here?
John, this is Dominic DeTavio. I'm curious on the Tennessee model about how it is that they accounted for things like STEM fields and at-risk students and the like. And the reason I wonder about that is I have the impression that those came up possibly because of other policy considerations rather than performance considerations, and the mission and different. I guess primarily the mission of the different institutions would strike me as the most relevant way to make the distinctions that Paula was talking about, rather than things like STEM and at risk. But I don't know if that is indeed the case, and if the STEM and at risk piece was in fact first proposed here as something for us to consider because we had kind of other policy things, legislative issues going on at the time, or were they in fact, or should they in fact be embedded in any kind of an outcomes-based model?
I think that's a fair question. I mean, I think there were other policy considerations, certainly in the case of critical fields, that might not, normally have been a part of outcomes-based. But obviously, there's a legitimate state policy involved there. I guess in going forward, I think the whole mission-specific issue is obviously one that we looked at last time and really had a difficult time with it. And Paul, I think one of the difficult things, I think in Tennessee you have like 9 institutions that are in your formula, and we have 38. So it is obviously more difficult with 38. And so I think that will be, to go into that issue, that's going to be the main thing we're going to have to try to figure out is how do you, with 38 institutions, how do we make those mission-specific distinctions in a way that works for everybody?
Well, we also had institutions that grouped, and then the institutions within themselves could establish a weight for those areas that not necessarily STEM or those, but because of their mission, the coordinating board oversaw the institution's development of weights that best fit their institutional profile, which they had to develop and get approved by the coordinating board before then the whole process of determining, what criteria and what weights apply to a particular institution. I acknowledge size is a big issue for Texas. I'm not sure, though, being first out of the chute with outcomes-based funding, even with 9 institutions, wasn't something to deal with that was incredibly difficult. So I know it can be done even when you're starting at ground zero. We just found that to be very, very helpful, though, to be able to have institutions really develop their institutional profile around what their mission was and then use that as a way of determining and verifying what would be an appropriate set of weights under the various criteria in the outcomes-based funding, which, again, I acknowledge the problem, but I guess sometimes, it's good to try to at least look at that and see if that would eliminate some of the issues that probably are going to surface otherwise.
John, you may recall that we actually invited Tennessee in probably 2 years ago. I think you may have been at that meeting. I know we had some legislators there and people from institutions. So, I think there are a number of models out there that, and if you wanted to bring them in again, I'm sure we could arrange for that. We'd be glad to make that happen if you'd like.
One thing that I would recommend is that you ask, if you do bring them in, and I think there are a couple of people that are really have been traveling the country talking about it in Tennessee, David Wright in particular, but and Russ Deaton, but it's not performance funding in Tennessee. That's a different piece of the whole model. The outcomes-based model is very different from Tennessee's long-standing performance funding model. So just that came up in some discussions that the performance funding model is not what you want to look at here. That's not what is their outcomes-based model in Tennessee. So I just add that just for clarification.
Well, I'm not sure what we got, but we got the official representative from Tennessee. So it was the outcomes-based. That's what I thought. So we did hear about that, and we've been interested in that for some time.
I just didn't want you to waste your time on something that wasn't going to be helpful.
Well, and I'm familiar with the previous performance funding model that was there in the 80s as well. So I know the distinction.
Any other comments? I do think there's value in looking at kind of the idea of institutional weights, having institutions have some more buy-in to this by determining their own weights within certain parameters and approval of the coordinating board. I know we discussed that last time, and I think it was more of a time constraint than anything else, and the fact that when you have 38 institutions, if you've got everybody developing some kind of weight in an allocation formula, it just makes it that much more complicated. To the extent that we move this away from the formula as a separate formula, that might be more practical at this point. But since we had really thought we would spend next meeting primarily on this topic, what I'd suggest then is to think about whether or not there is anything we want to do differently in light of Paul's remarks and any other. I know there were some issues. Cynthia, for instance, had issues with the way we ended up last time, so it's not like we came up with the perfect model by any means. But come next time with whatever thoughts on what you think we ought to work on at this point, if anything. And feel free to give me a call. Also, if you want to have any discussions about that before the next meeting. And we'll have that discussion. If it requires a considerable amount of work, my guess is that we'll appoint maybe a subcommittee or something like that, unless everybody just wants to be involved, which is fine too. That would require some additional time, but because we only have the 3 charges at this point, we have the time to do that if we so wish. So does that sound reasonable for everybody? Okay. On the issue of additional charges, Perry, did you want to say anything about that?
I did have a question. Having been on the committee last year, the committee recommended, at least I have it in the draft, the last draft, I think, that we considered removing the enrollment classification adjustment and funding all the hours taught in a course at the level of the course. After doing that, then they said funding at the enrollment classification level when the classification is lower than the course level prevents institutions from elevating reported course levels and increasing funding levels. The committee concluded the measure is producing a minimal effect, indicating there are few instances where the classification is lower than the course level. While GAFAC appreciates the simplification of removing the adjustment, which would be rational if it doesn't have much impact, it recommends continuing the adjustment at this time and having the next GAFAC review the matter. And I asked specifically that we have this group review that again. And I brought this up with Paul, and I also brought it up with John. And John's good response, well, that wasn't the commissioner's recommendation or charge. And I guess I have a general question on that. Is by statute, are we limited to whatever the commissioner's recommendations or charges?
This committee can make recommendations on whatever else. If
That
you would
was
like
my
to.
conclusion, but I wanted to make sure that
Yes.
that was the appropriate conclusion.
I think it's important to note that where there are differences between this committee recommendations and the commissioners, that you will be able to present those directly to the board.
Correct. Any case, this was one that was left over, in a sense, from the last committee. And by logic, if the conclusion of the committee is that this adjustment has minimal impact, then I don't know why we would keep it. And by logic, a course is a course. And a professor walks into it, and they see juniors, and they conduct the course as if they have juniors, and don't isolate out sophomores who happen to be in it. So, but anyway, I mean, I'd like to have it considered. I have a second one also while I'm on a roll.
Paul, was there more than what was written into that recommendation? Was it a capturing of the data issue as well?
Not that I recall. My recollection of this is it died in the first September meeting that we had, not the August meeting, but the September one. And then it was decided that it wasn't, and there was no interest in changing it at that time.
I guess at first glance, I'd like to see it modeled again and see if the conclusion of the committee in the report, which was that it didn't have any impact, is first true, and then see if it does have an impact, where and how, and then go forward from there.
We can do that.
Yeah, and I don't remember that much about the discussion of it, so I think if you have the model for the next meeting, we'll have some time to think about that, and maybe we can reconstruct. I can talk to BJ about that since she chaired the committee last time, but anyway, we'll have the information we can bring.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The second one, and it doesn't relate to anything we've done in the past. This is new, but the teaching supplement which provides additional weighting of the credit hours taught by tenure and tenure line faculty by statute. I think that that's an appropriate supplement because I think it speaks to experience of faculty that they can bring and perhaps commitment of faculty that they can bring to the institution and to the classroom, because we assume the tenure and tenure line faculty are there. It's generally a safe assumption, and that they are going to be conducting their office hours and meeting with students. But this conclusion about tenure and tenure line faculty probably extends, at least in teaching, to full-time faculty, whether they are on tenure and tenure line or whether they are not. And I would ask again that we perhaps model this, that's my first request, and I think, Paul, for all full-time faculty, not just tenure and tenure line faculty, but all full-time, not adjuncts, but full-time faculty who may or may not be on tenure line. I know some outstanding faculty who are full-time, not on tenure line, but they have committed themselves to teaching, and particularly to teaching at levels that sometimes tenure line faculty are not, well, they wouldn't want that to make up most of their load. That's in our core courses generally.
So just to make sure that I understand on that last one, you want me to do a model where we don't use the tenure track supplement, but we use just the hours that
full-time faculty
are taught by full-time faculty,
including tenure and tenure line.
Okay, wait.
Tenure track and full-time faculty.
So they have to be tenure track and full-time?
No.
Tenure track or full-time.
Okay.
One is a subset of the other, yeah.
They're full-time.
Okay.
We've got that. I can help you with that one.
Right.
All right, got it. Thanks.
Now, this is an issue that the Form Advisory Committee has looked at before. It's been a while. And BJ or Gene that have been around might remember. My recollection is that legislative intent certainly played into it, because Senator Ratliff's intent clearly was tenure. In fact, I'm not even sure he said tenure track. I think we sort of expanded that. But at whatever time that in the past that was, I mean, the committee did choose not to extend it beyond that at that time. But there's certainly no reason why we can't look at it at this point in time. And
I happened to be in his office on numerous occasions on that various topic, and at least the way I read his intent, he just wanted to be sure students in the lower division had good instruction. Right. And he assumed that two things. One, if you were tenure, and I think maybe this committee extended tenure track, that you were going to be a better professor. And he assumed that the more professor earned, the better professor they were. And so there were some assumptions built into that, but it was clear he was trying to look after that freshman student to make sure they had a good class. So the intent was, I think, a good one that may be reflected in what Perry's saying.
Well, Paul, if you'll send that to us before the next meeting, we'll have a chance to look at it and then discuss it at that time.
John?
Yes.
If I could ask the group, how many of your institutions have senior lecturers and distinguished senior lecturers?
Yeah.
A couple. Well, whatever you call them, yeah. I mean, I think that would help to add some teeth to it, because the distinguished senior lecturers that we have at UT Austin, I would stand shoulder to shoulder with them any day. They're really remarkable teachers.
One of the issues with knowing that is that at one time we made a decision in terms of reporting that here's what a person is when you report to us, but institutions may call them something differently. So we wouldn't necessarily know that someone was a senior distinguished lecturer versus being a lecturer, because we didn't want to control that, but we needed to have people that fit into categories. Mainly that there was a long-term commitment by the university, whether it was on tenure track or as a lecturer instructor. And so if you wanted to get into that distinction, you guys might have to provide some additional data to get to that. We wouldn't know.
David, I think what Perry is proposing would get at it. Whether we ultimately go in that direction is for the committee to decide. But I know in the case of being a brand new university, we have a capped and small portion of our overall faculty that is called professional track. We make full-time commitments to them. They are full-time faculty. Many of them come out of industry with a great deal of experience to bring into the classroom. And there is a trend across the nation to see more of that happen.
And that would be you would be able to report that to us. This may not be called the same thing.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. That's why I like the approach of simply full-time faculty.
All right, then we'll take a look at the model that Paul sends us and discuss that at the next meeting. Any other comments regarding charges? If not, Paul sent a list of a survey of the members' availability for future meetings. It's page 63 in your documents. And the dates that we have the best attendance are a little bit different than the ones that Paul originally proposed, which is not unusual. That's the way this usually works, is we poll members to see what their availability is. So the most important thing is that we'll have at least 13 members, and if Paula is able to make it, it'll be all of us here for the October 2nd as our next meeting. So I just want to verify that that's a good date for everybody. Okay, then our next meeting will be October 2nd. And then for planning purposes, the other two dates that popped up are November 18th and December 4th. So I'd like to propose that we set those as the dates for those monthly meetings, assuming we need both of them, which is uncertain at this time. But okay. So we'll set November 18th as our November meeting date and December 4th as the December meeting date. Is there any other business for the committee then? If not, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.